Hello everybody and welcome back. And today I have the video of me visiting the USS North Carolina Battleship Memorial down in Wilmington, North Carolina. And basically I am going to do sort of a hybrid know your ship and at the same time talk about things that I picked up while I was on the museum. And here she is, the absolutely gorgeous USS North Carolina. Now, of course, by the time that I was able to get this beautiful shot, it was already late in the afternoon, early on in the day. Unfortunately, it's a little bit on the cloudy, gray, gloomy side. So you'll see that in some of the other photos. Absolutely beautiful ship, and of course, let's talk a little bit about her. The USS North Carolina was laid down October the 27th of 1937 at the New York Navy Yard, and she was launched June 13th, 1940, and finally commissioned into service April 9th of 1941. She's 221 meters long, she has a 33-meter beam, and a 10.1-meter draft. She displaced around 34,000 metric tons standard to about 40,000 metric tons fully loaded. Of course, by 1945, displacement had increased to roughly another 2,300 metric tons. Obviously, you get on the big battleship and the first thing you notice are the big 16-inch 45 caliber Mark VI guns. These guns could of course hurl a 2,700 pound or 1,225 kilogram super heavy Mark VIII armor-piercing shell out to a max range around 36,900 yards or around 33.7 kilometers at a 45-degree elevation. Take the shells, just around 80 seconds to reach max range. As the North Carolina carried the 16-inch 45 caliber gun, it had a shorter gun barrel length compared to the Iowa class's 16-inch 50 caliber guns. While this reduced the North Carolina shell penetration against side armor at range, it did increase the deck armor penetration as the shells were coming down at a much steeper angle at range. So comparatively speaking, the North Carolina, for example, when she elevated her guns to just over 35 degrees, she'd get a range of about 35,000 yards. The Iowa could accomplish the same kind of range by elevating her guns just under 30 degrees. At this kind of range, North Carolina's guns could penetrate around 266 millimeters of side armor, but 268 millimeters of deck armor. While the Iowa could manage 329 millimeters of side armor penetration, she could only get 215 millimeters of deck armor penetration, as the shells would be coming in at a much flatter trajectory. The North Carolina's guns could also fire an 862 kilogram or 1,900 pound high explosive shell for soft targets. These guns could manage a 2-round per minute rate of fire. So let's first go to the area that is responsible for essentially for the guns to go boom. That's the gunpowder, and this is the gunpowder storage area. You need a 690-pound bags of gunpowder in order to fire a shell. That's 540 pounds of gunpowder in total. First things first, they'd extract the powder from their containers, and then they would move that powder to the powder hoist so it can be sent up to the gun turrets. Honestly, even so many years later, when I walked into this particular area of the ship, I swear I could still smell gunpowder. So, that's something that you really have to go to the actual museum, step in here to really experience. So once the powder has been removed from the storage room, it gets passed out into this area at the bottom called the powder flat. The bags are passed through where the green arrow is pointing, comes out. They take the bags of powder, load them up into the powder hoist, and it gets sent up to the gun turrets. Now, this is under the number 2 turret, so this is the mezzanine level apparently, and that's where they get additional shell storage. Only with the number 2 turret is it a deck up, so they get some additional storage here. But you kind of get a sense of sort of how big this particular area is. Now, one more deck up from where I was in the previous little clip. From the mezzanine up, there is the actual, this is the shell flat area where the shells are stored. Now, I'm pretty sure if I was in the number 1 or number 3 gun turrets, this is what I would have seen for the shell storage area. Just that with number 2, there was a little bit more storage one deck below. So this area, the shells get put into shell hoists, and that gets sent up to the main guns. And of course, I will also show you from inside of the main gun turrets where these shells come up from, and of course where the powder comes up from, and how the whole loading mechanism essentially works. So, but anyways, this is where the shells are stored before they are to be used for combat. Of course, the final destination for the shells and the powder is the turrets themselves. And so here we are inside. This was turret number 3. On this side, where the green arrow is pointing right now, that is the backup fire control range plots and everything. And on the other side, where the green arrow is pointing now, that's where the guns themselves are. So we're going to look at the guns and, of course, explain sort of how the loading goes. So first up, the shell comes up through the shell hoist, and it comes straight up onto this ramp. This ramp basically comes down, and the shell is rammed into the gun itself. That's the first step. Once that is done, of course, you have to get the powder onto that ramp, and you have to ram the powder into the gun as well. And then, of course, the gun is ready to fire. So in the next picture here, you see the powder coming out from that little door on the, I guess this will be the left-hand side where the arrow is pointing now. And that's where the powder hoist brought up all the powder. So the door opens, 3 bags come out, and then of course 3 more bags come out, and then you have 6 bags of powder in total. And all 6 bags of powder are then rammed into the gun itself. And then of course you close up the breech and the gun is ready to fire. Now these main guns are controlled essentially from the central plotting area of the ship, which we will get to a little bit later. And of course that central plotting area normally directs all the guns. However, in the event that that area gets taken out, there are some backup systems in place. So inside the turret, you'll see that there is a small range keeper, as well as, of course, there's this really large optic as well that is inside the turret. Of course, now we're going to go back down into the ship, into the armored area of the ship, and you have this room. And this is the main battery plot. Now, in this room, you have equipment like the Mark 8 range keeper, you have the Mark 41 stable vertical, and the Mark 13 fire control radar's controls and displays. Now the Mark 8 was an analog computer whose purpose was to calculate where they should aim the guns in order to hit some target in the distance. It did this automatically by factoring information it got from the ship's Mark 38 16-inch fire directors, the ship's fire control radar, the gyro compass for true course of the ship, the pedometer log for the ship's speed, the stable vertical, and also relative wind speed and direction. Further data that had to be manually inputted included things like the average initial velocity of the shells and air density. The rangekeeper further added corrections for things like gravity, the Coriolis effect, and the Earth's curvature. The result of all this was that the turret's bearing and elevation orders were provided so that the guns could be aimed and fired. Going back to the outside of the ship, where the green arrow is pointing, that is the Ford Mark 38 16-inch directors. Now on top of that should be a Mark 13 fire control radar, but unfortunately I don't think that one was there. But it is easier to see from the aft director, and as you can see where the green arrow is, that's the Mark 38 director, and where the red arrow is pointing, that is the Mark 13 fire control radar. The big round dish near the front, that is the SK2 air search radar on the USS North Carolina. One other neat thing was actually this firing trigger. Now, this was the trigger you'd pull to fire off the main guns, but interestingly enough, if you actually look at modern ballistic missile submarines and their triggers to fire off their nuclear missiles, it's a very, very similar design. And since we're talking about armament, we might as well keep talking about the small armament that exists on the North Carolina as well. That would be the 5-inch 38 caliber guns, of which there are 20 guns in total in 10 dual mounts, 5 per each side of the ship. Now these guns could fire a large variety of shells, although anti-aircraft common shells were the most common on the ship, as they had the greatest use. Other types of shells that were carried included armor-piercing, star shells, white phosphorus. There are also something called window shells, which is basically, I think, some sort of metallic strips which could confuse radar, and of course practice shells. And practice is a big part of the crew's lives, the crews that operated these 5-inch 38 caliber guns. They could fire their shells out to a maximum of 18,000 yards, or about 16 kilometers, or engage aircraft up to 37,200 feet at 85-degree elevation. These guns were directed by the Mark 37 fire control directors, of which there are 4 of them on the North Carolina, one of which is marked with the green arrow. And of course, the 5-inch 38 guns also had their own fire control computers. These were the Mark 1As. And in terms of position, these particular fire control computers were right next to the room with the equipment for the 16-inch guns. So you had on the one side the range keepers for the 16-inch guns, and in the room over, you had all of these fire control computers for the 5-inch 38s. And even though the fire control directors plus the computers, everything made the 5-inch 38s a deadly anti-aircraft weapon, it still took on average about 100 rounds before they were able to shoot down one aircraft. And after all that, you're probably getting a sense of just how sophisticated the US Navy's fire control and direction was. In fact, even their 40mm AA guns were directed. Where the green arrow is pointing, that's the fire control director for the aft 40mm guns. Now, all of them had their own directors as well. In fact, the only ones that were manually aimed were the 20mm guns manned by the individual sailors. Pretty much every other gun on the ship had some form of fire control direction. Now, the 40mm Bofors gun wasn't initially installed onto the North Carolina. In fact, when she first came out and was commissioned to Navy, she had 16 1.1-inch guns and some 50 caliber machine guns. Of course, with some experience in the war, quickly realized that the 1.1-inch guns, the 50 caliber machine guns, just weren't enough. So by December of 1941, some 20mm Oerlikons were added, and then by 1944, 40mm guns were predominant on the North Carolina, with 60 of them being placed around the ship in quad mounts. And of course, the 20mm guns reached a peak of about 48 of them in 1944, which was reduced to about 36 by 1945. Now, earlier I mentioned that these guns were directed from a director station. These guns also happened to be powered, which increased the speed that they could be trained and elevated. So in their powered state, the 40mm Bofors in the quad mounts could train at 26 degrees a second, and they could elevate at 24 degrees a second. Compared to the Japanese 25mm guns, which were cranked mostly by hand, the 40mm Bofors had a huge advantage in terms of tracking fast-moving Japanese aircraft, giving them, of course, an edge in dealing with those said enemy aircraft. Now, to get a sense of how important train speed is, here is a fellow World of Warships player who came out to meet me, basically manually training these guns. Now, imagine trying to shoot down a fast-moving aircraft with this kind of train speed. I think it's fair to say good luck and have fun, but yeah, not very effective, and so that's why the powered mounts were very, very important. One of the very first tests of the North Carolina's AA occurred on August 24th of 1942, and this was actually before she even got her 40mm guns. In fact, at this time she only had her 1.1s, and she'd gotten some 20mm Oerlikons, and she still had her 50 calibers. Now, during the Battle for Guadalcanal, the Japanese launched an airstrike against the Saratoga and Enterprise from the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. During this attack, North Carolina shielded the Enterprise with AA fire from her 5-inch guns. But around 5:13 that afternoon, Japanese torpedo and glide bombers attacked the ship from all directions, and the North Carolina's entire AA arsenal of 25-inch guns, 16 1.1s, 40 20mm guns, and 26 50 cals opened up with everything they got. The resulting barrage of anti-aircraft fire caused Admiral Kincaid on the Enterprise to ask the North Carolina if she had been hit. This was, after all, the very first time that anybody had ever seen a fast battleship open up with everything she had. Anyways, during this battle, the North Carolina was credited with 7 enemy planes shot down, although it's possible she was responsible for up to 14. During the engagement, she fired over 800 5-inch shells, over 1,000 1.1-inch shells, almost 7,500 20mm rounds, and over 8,500 50 caliber bullets. The crew would describe this battle as 7 minutes of hell. Armor protection of the North Carolina utilized an all-or-nothing protection scheme, which comprised 41% of the total displacement of the ship. However, even then, the armor of the North Carolina was still insufficient against 16-inch shells. It was mostly designed against 14-inch shell fire. This is the reason why the US Navy eventually went ahead and designed and built the South Dakota class battleships, which offered protection against 16-inch shells. Anyways, the North Carolina had 12 inches of belt armor that was inclined at 15 degrees, and that decreased down to 6.6 inches under the waterline. The ship also had 3 layers of deck armor with a 1.45-inch first layer, a second layer that would protect the ship's vitals, and that was the thickest and varied between 5 to 5.5 inches, depending on if you were at the center line of the ship or out towards the sides of the ship. Finally, there was a third thin layer that protected against shrapnel that might have gotten past the second layer. Then, of course, we have the turrets, which, of course, have quite substantial amounts of armor. So if you take a look at the picture, you'll see that front faceplate. That was 16 inches of armor plate. Then there is 9.8 inches on the side, 11.8 inches to the rear, and a 7-inch roof plate. The conning tower of the USS North Carolina had up to 16 inches of armor, and as you can see right here, as I'm stepping through, that's the thickness of the armor we're talking about. Now obviously the conning tower of the ship is where, let's say a battleship was to fight another battleship, all the command crew essentially would get into this protected space in order to continue directing the fight against the enemy ship. Interestingly enough, for both the Royal Navy and the US Navy, a lot of command crews during naval engagements preferred staying on the unarmored bridge instead of coming into this protected citadel because the bridge offered much superior visibility. If you look at this citadel area, you'll notice how the only visibility you can get is through a few small slits. And speaking of the bridge, here it is. And as you can tell, a lot more spacious, a lot more windows to look through, and of course, definitely much improved visibility. As you can tell, a lot easier to see things outside. And I would guess from the command staff's perspective, a lot easier to see what the heck is going on compared to being stuck in a very, very small area where your outside vision's very, very limited. So most command staff still prefer to be in this particular area. The North Carolina also had a pretty extensive torpedo protection system, which was put to the test on September the 15th of 1942, when the North Carolina encountered possibly the luckiest submarine of the Second World War, I-19. The Japanese submarine fired 6 torpedoes at the carrier USS Wasp and hit her with 3 torpedoes. 3 other torpedoes managed to pass by the Wasp, out of which 2 of them headed towards the USS O'Brien. Now, the USS O'Brien managed to dodge one of these torpedoes, but then ran into the other torpedo. The last torpedo managed to go all the way out and hit the USS North Carolina a few hundred meters before it ran out of range, and it managed to hit the North Carolina below the waterline, just behind the number 1 turret. Torpedo created a hole 9.8 meters by 5.5 meters, killed 5 men and wounded 20. Yet even after such a torpedo hit, the North Carolina could still maintain a comfortable 24 knots. In terms of propulsion, the North Carolina has 4 separate machinery spaces. Now, this was designed in a way so that if one of the sections got flooded, the entire ship doesn't come to a screeching halt. Now, in each of these machinery spaces, there were 2 Babcock and Wilcox 3-drum boilers, which connected to a high-pressure turbine, a low-pressure turbine, and a reduction gear, which then in turn was connected through a shaft to a screw. Now, I'm not a naval engineer, but I'm going to try my best to explain this entire process, hopefully in a way that you guys will understand how this whole thing kind of works. So the boilers, they produce high pressure, high temperature steam. And this is first pushed through the high pressure turbines, which is 12 stages, and get up to 5,904 RPM max. Once the steam passes through the high pressure turbines, it's then pushed through a low pressure turbine. Now, the low pressure turbine has 6 stages and gets up to a maximum of 4,937 RPM. Both the high pressure and low pressure turbines work together to generate power to turn the screws and push the ship forward. Although the low pressure turbine is the only one that is capable of moving the ship backwards. Now, since we're talking about a ship and we're not really talking about an airplane, the screws of the ship definitely don't want to turn anywhere near 5,000 RPM. So it is put through a 30 to 1, I believe, reduction gear, which is this huge thing, by the way, and it slows down the shaft RPM down to something pretty darn reasonable, and of course that allows the ship to move forward or back, depending on what the captain orders. Now, the ship produces a maximum of 121,000 shaft horsepower, and it can push a ship up to a maximum of 28 knots. Now, in order to get to 28 knots, the shaft has to rotate to a maximum of 199 RPM, although a more economical cruising speed of 15 knots only requires 98 RPM on the shaft. The steam in the low-pressure turbine isn't actually wasted. There is a condenser underneath the turbine that cools the steam down using seawater, which is then recycled back as boiler feed water. And to take a look at the system in the actual machinery room, so there's the high-pressure turbine where the green arrow is indicating, and you can see there is a main steam supply as well as an exhaust. The exhaust, indicated by the green arrow here, connects the high pressure to the low pressure turbine, which the green arrow is indicating here. And then, of course, these two combined, as you can tell, there's both two sort of things connecting into this big green thing, which is the reduction gear. And then, of course, this reduces that rotations per minute down to something reasonable. And, of course, the reduction gear is connected to the shaft, which is then connected to the propeller. One of the really neat things that I found about the machinery room was just how well organized everything was. I mean, every single thing in that machinery room was color-coded, and as long as you knew what the colors were and you knew how many stripes they put, you knew exactly what it did. So if you went back and you took a look at the part where I was showing you the high pressure, low pressure, and that crossover, you'll see how it's marked in black. And that indicates that it's either steam supply or steam exhaust. To steer the ship, the North Carolina had 2 rudders, and of course that area of the ship was actually open to the public as well. And it's a really, really big mechanism. So first up, of course, is the rudder's sort of power and control area. And so this is, I guess, where the sailors would be to sort of tell which way the rudder is supposed to go. And this room is actually not the bigger room. This is actually the smaller of the 2 rooms. And then, of course, you get into the actual hydraulic assembly. Take a look. I mean, that is a huge mechanism. And this is only for one of the rudders. There's another one right next door, essentially. And that, I guess, controls the second rudder. So really, really big mechanism. Really surprised at just how big it was. Alright, so time to go back up, and we're going to go back to the stern of the ship. And one of the first things you actually see, aside from the 16-inch gun, is actually this Kingfisher scout plane. Now, the North Carolina actually carried 3 of these, and they were used, of course, for scouting and, of course, for shell spotting if you're firing at long distances. However, you might notice that on the North Carolina, the catapults for the Kingfisher are gone. And according to the docent that showed me around the ship and explained things, the reason why the catapults were removed was because the North Carolina, by the later stages of the war, was able to fully depend on radar for its fire control. So these Kingfishers didn't really serve much of a purpose, so they removed them, and that's that. Now, I gotta say that at this particular scout plane, I actually learned something pretty cool. So I always in the past thought that these planes would land on the water, taxi up next to the battleship, and the battleship would just hoist them on board. In fact, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So what happens is that the battleship, especially during rougher seas, will make a nice hard turn, and using its wake will generate a patch of calm water. The Kingfisher will come in, land on that patch of calm water, and then taxi up towards what looks like a mat to me. And this mat has a couple of these holes in it, and the Kingfisher will push onto the mat. And there's a couple of hooks on the front float, and then at least the main float. And these hooks will latch onto the holes in the mat, And then, of course, the plane won't drift away anymore. And then a crane will come over and hoist the plane on board. So yeah, I mean, went to the museum and learned something pretty cool about how scout planes are recovered. See, most times when you see them in video games, they magically get catapulted out and then they magically come back and then just appear on your ship again. So kind of neat to actually find out how the whole thing worked in real life. But if you're going to talk about a ship, you eventually have to talk about the crew, because that's what gives the ship's life. And of course, why not start with the enlisted men? I mean, this is their sleeping areas, and of course, as always, rank has its privileges. If you were the new guy, you slept in pretty much the worst spot, by the door. People could kind of come in and out and kind of keep you up all night. And then, of course, if you had, let's say, a higher rank, then you would sleep in a nice quiet corner where not many people would bother you. As an enlisted man, unfortunately, things were not always the most comfortable. I mean, here is the place where you would, let's say, wash up, and, well, not much for privacy here, because, hey, imagine you're washing up and then you look up and some guy's doing his business right there. If, however, you were an officer, then things were quite a bit more comfortable. So this is what an officer's stateroom would be. Quite a drastic improvement over what the enlisted man got. You'd actually had your own room, a bit more privacy. Of course, rank did come with more responsibilities as well. But, I mean, if I had to trade this for a bunk, I think I'd take this. Then you had the ship's bakery, which had to bake 1,600 loaves of bread per day. That's over like 20,000 slices of bread, mind you. And they had to do this in a very, very small area. So I was quite impressed by that. Then, of course, you had the enlisted man's galley, essentially. This is where they would get food. Of course, if you were an officer, things were much, much nicer. You obviously sat down at a table, tablecloths, and stewards serving you. But if you were an enlisted man, you ate in a cafeteria kind of like this. And pretty much all the needs of the sailor are essentially taken care of. The battleship is in a way a floating city. I mean, there's a barber shop. This is the laundry, and it's a huge laundry facility, mind you. There's just everything, washing to pressing. I mean, I was just really surprised. I did not think for a moment that the laundry facility of a ship would be as big as this. So, yeah, impressive, definitely impressive size-wise. Although, I do think, if I remember correctly, I think the one on the carrier was bigger, but I mean, there is that much more people on an aircraft carrier after all. There was even a projector room for movies. And on the North Carolina, in the museum, there's this little room here called the projector room. And according to the docent, the equipment on the inside is actually some of the original equipment from way, way back. So yeah, I mean, if I could actually get a good photo, which unfortunately I couldn't, but inside, behind that sort of, I guess that would be like a metal grill, you could actually see some of the original equipment from when the ship was still in service. Now, the battleship also had a pretty complete set of medical facilities. So doctor's offices, laboratories, pretty sure there was a dentist's office somewhere there as well. There was a dispensary, and of course, it is a combat vessel, so there's a surgical bay as well to perform surgeries. One of the most interesting thing about the medical facilities is that after you get into surgery, come out, or you're sick, whatever, and you're put into the sick ward, well, aside from the necessary rooms on the ship, this is the only other room that had AC. Not even the captain's cabin had AC, so if you got sick, at least you were somewhere comfortable. Now, think about a big battleship for a minute. Think about what the average age of sailors would be. And you'd probably be right if you guessed not too old. And so, of course, with a bunch of young guys, people were going to play some tricks on each other. I mean, that seems to be a thing on these ships. So, for example, one of the stories I think I remember reading was right here at the dispersing office. Now, apparently there was a new guy who'd come in as like one of the officers in this office, and so he opens up the safe one day, and there's like a green pea there. And he's like, oh, how did this pea get here? So he takes the pea out and he throws it away. And then the very next day he opens the safe again and there's another green pea. So he's like, did I forget to throw out the one yesterday? Takes one, throws it away. And then the very next day he goes, opens the safe, and there's another green pea. And apparently one of the other sailors was playing a prank on him, drilled a little hole into the underside of the safe, and every night would stick a pea in there for the sole purpose of trying to drive the guy crazy. So just one of those stories, and like I said, ship full of young guys, probably gonna pull some pranks on each other. Of course, one of the major advantages of serving on a battleship during World War II compared to serving on a destroyer is that on a battleship you actually had an ice cream machine that could make ice cream. Destroyers didn't have things like this, and so they had to usually do something nice, usually like, let's say, pick up a downed crew member for an aircraft carrier, and they could get their hands on some ice cream. So if you're on a destroyer, you gotta hope that you get lucky. On a battleship, well, these facilities were available. And one final piece of interesting little tidbits of information is actually happening to do with this particular garbage grinder. I actually didn't know this until I went to the museum and saw it, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. So apparently the ship's garbage is brought here, it's ground up, mixed with water, and then released over the ship's propellers. And what this did was it sort of dissipated this garbage away, and so it didn't form a visible trail that the enemy could follow all the way back to the ship. So this garbage grinder actually was essential for the ship's security, and I thought that was a pretty cool thing. Anyways, folks, that brings us to the end of this particular video. I hope you enjoyed it. The USS North Carolina Museum is a fantastic museum, and if you ever get a chance to go to Wilmington, I definitely recommend that you go and check out this museum. There's a lot more things for you to see, and there's a lot more things to learn as well. One final thing that I want to do before I sign off is I want to thank Mr. Bidding for being an amazing tour guide, and also, of course, the World of Warships player who came out to hang with me. Thank you guys so much for making it an amazing day. Anyways, folks, I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and sub. Aside from all that, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to all of you again really, really soon.